For 300 years, the Vikings were the most feared thing in Europe. Monasteries emptied at the sight of their sails. Kings handed over fortunes just to make them look somewhere else. There was a prayer priests actually recited. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. And then you put a wall in front of them. Just a wall. Some stone, some timber, and a few hundred tired men standing behind it. And the most feared warriors in the world suddenly had no idea what to do. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about the Vikings. They were terrible at sieges. Not a little rusty. Historically, embarrassingly bad. And the story of why is also the story of how the entire Viking Age quietly came to an end. Not with a battle they lost, but with a problem they could never solve. Let's be clear about the flip, because it's sharper than it sounds. The Vikings weren't bad at war. Man for man, in the open, they were as dangerous as anyone alive. The problem is that there are two completely different kinds of war. There's the war of movement, hit, grab, vanish, and there's the war of the wall, sit, starve, grind, engineer. The Vikings were arguably the best in the world at the first one, and close to the worst at the second. And here's the cruel twist. The second kind is the one that actually decides who keeps the land. So this isn't a story about weak men. It's a story about specialists. And what happens when the world learns to make a specialist fight on the one ground he can't win? To understand why they failed, you first have to understand why they were so terrifying. Rewind to June 8th, 793. A monastery on a tiny island off the northeast coast of England, Lindisfarne. No real walls, no soldiers, just monks, gold, and the sea. The Vikings come out of that sea, take everything that isn't nailed down and some things that are, and they're gone before anyone with a sword can arrive. That is the entire Viking business model in one sentence. And it worked because of one machine, the longship. A Viking longship could cross open ocean and row up a river only a few feet deep. No fixed schedule, no supply train, no siege to plan. It let a few hundred men appear out of nowhere, 100 miles inland, at a target that had no idea they were coming, and vanish the same way. Speed, surprise, mobility, undefended targets. Those four things made the Vikings the apex predator of early medieval Europe. Now hold those four things in your head, because every single one of them becomes useless. Worse than useless, the moment the loot is sitting behind a wall. Here's what terrible at sieges actually looks like. November 885. A Viking fleet comes up the River Seine toward Paris. And this is not a raiding party. A monk named Abbo, who was inside the city and watched it happen, describes hundreds of ships and, at the high end, tens of thousands of men. Against that, Paris has a garrison of roughly 200. 200, read that ratio again. The Vikings show up, demand tribute, and fully expect the usual. Take the silver, sail on. The man in charge, Count Odo, says no. And what follows is one of the most lopsided mismatches in medieval history, running the wrong way. The Vikings attack with everything siege warfare is supposed to use: catapults, battering rams, siege towers, war machines. The defenders answer with a boiling mixture of hot wax and pitch poured down onto them, and every assault breaks apart. So the Vikings get creative. They try to fill the shallows around a defensive tower with rubble, with branches, with the carcasses of animals, and, when those run out, with the bodies of dead prisoners. It doesn't work. They pack 3 ships with firewood, set them ablaze, and steer them into the wooden bridge to burn it down. The fire ships drift into a heap of stones and sink. The bridge survives. And then, this is the part that tells you everything. The siege just keeps going. Winter, spring, summer, a full year. Most of the Vikings eventually get bored and wander off to pillage the easy, unwalled countryside, because that's the thing they're actually good at. And how does it end? In October 886, the Frankish Emperor Charles the Fat finally arrives with a massive army. The Vikings are cornered, and instead of crushing them, he pays them roughly 700 pounds of silver and grants them permission to sail past Paris and go loot Burgundy instead. The most feared army in Europe besieged a city defended by 200 men for a year and had to be paid to leave. Count Odo was so disgusted by the deal, he'd go on to be elected king himself. That's not a victory. That's a bill. Now, you might be thinking, fine, but the Vikings did sack walled cities. And they did. Occasionally. The problem is how. Here's my favorite example, and I'll flag up front that it comes from a later chronicler and is probably half legend. But medieval writers kept telling it because it captured something true about how Vikings dealt with walls. Around the year 860, a chieftain named Hastein sails into the Mediterranean and finds a walled Italian city he's convinced is Rome. He looks at the walls. He knows he can't take them by force. So he doesn't. Instead, he sends word that he, the great chieftain, is dying, and with his final breath, wishes to convert to Christianity and be buried on holy ground inside the city. The townspeople are moved. They agree. A solemn funeral procession carries his coffin through the gates. And inside the church at the graveside, the very much alive Hastein bursts out of the coffin, sword in hand, cuts down the bishop, and his men throw open the gates. It works perfectly. There's just one problem. It wasn't Rome. It was a much smaller town called Luni, about 250 miles too far north. And when Hastein discovered he'd faked his own funeral, leapt out of a coffin and murdered a bishop to sack the wrong city. He was reportedly so humiliated that he had the townsmen massacred out of pure spite. Sit with the lesson buried in that story. The single most famous case of a Viking taking a fortified city isn't a siege at all. It's a con, because the con was the only tool that worked. Which raises an obvious question. If the one thing Vikings could never beat was a wall, what happens when the rest of Europe figures that out? They figured it out. And this is the part that actually ended the Viking Age. Go back to that bridge at Paris, the one the fire ships couldn't burn. Why was it even there? Because 20 years earlier, in 864, a Frankish king named Charles the Bald issued an order called the Edict of Monasteries, and part of it was almost insultingly simple. Build fortified bridges across the rivers, not to win battles, just to sit there. A low fortified bridge does exactly one thing. It stops a longship from rowing upstream. And the moment you stop the longship, you've taken away the Vikings' superpower, the ability to appear anywhere. In England, a king named Alfred took the same idea and turned it into a system. Alfred built around 30 fortified towns, called burhs, and placed them so that nowhere in his kingdom was more than about 20 miles, a single day's march, from one of them, each one garrisoned, each one able to send help to the next. He even reorganized his army so that half the men were always on duty while the other half farmed, which meant his force didn't just melt away at harvest time the way medieval armies always did. Think about what that does to a raid. You land. You move inland to grab loot. And now, everywhere you go, there's a walled town within a day's walk, full of armed men that you cannot take. And if you try to just slip past it, those men come out and hit you from behind or burn your boats. Your speed is gone. Your surprise is gone. Your safe, undefended targets are gone. When the Vikings came back to Wessex in 892, one historian describes what they found: a kingdom defended by a mobile field army and a network of garrisoned forts guarding every river and road. They had no answer. And so the real Viking strategy against walls became the least heroic thing imaginable: extortion. It even had a name: Danegeld, Dane payment. Pay them silver to go away. And they took it again and again because they literally could not take the walls the silver was hiding behind. At its worst, a single payment could run to 20,000 pounds of silver. Their business model against fortified Europe wasn't conquest. It was a protection racket. And even that only worked until Europe stopped paying and started building. So here's the reframe, and I think it's the real answer to the title. The Vikings weren't bad soldiers. They were a shark. In the water, the open sea, the undefended coast, the river with no bridge, a shark is the most terrifying thing alive. Nothing catches it, nothing sees it coming, nothing survives it. But a wall is dry land, and you can be the most perfect predator the ocean ever produced, and still be completely helpless the moment someone drags you 3 feet up the beach. Everything that made the Viking a god at sea, the speed, the surprise, the refusal to sit still, is exactly what made him useless in front of a wall, where the only things that win are the things he never built: patience, engineering, and the willingness to sit in the mud for a year. The Vikings didn't lose the Viking Age in a battle. They lost it to masonry. Europe simply figured out how to make the shark fight on land, and then built beaches everywhere. And that's the part that outlives the Vikings, because it isn't really about the Vikings at all. Every unstoppable force in history has a water and a land, an environment where it's a genius, and an environment where it's helpless. The whole game, from 793 to right now, is figuring out which is which, and making sure that when the fight comes, it comes on your ground, not theirs. The Vikings never solved their wall. Most things that look unstoppable have one. They just haven't met it yet. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us. Turns out, all it really took was a wall.